praise to the Most High. Today I'm speaking louder, of course, because I have noticed that YouTube has been muffling my voice due to the fact that I'm bringing tons of truth and I'm not violating any of their rules. And the fact is, you do live in a matrix. The matrix is a systematic system. You live in two parts of a matrix. You live in a reality which is a matrix that the Most High made, but the problem is you never see that reality, because that reality has been snatched from you, and because it has been snatched from you, you only see the reality that they want you to see, quote unquote, the second matrix. This reality controls everything you think, feel, and so forth by the news media and other propaganda tools that the outsiders, and when I say the outsiders, I'm actually not talking about the outside 12 tribe nations, although the outside 12 tribe nations, unfortunately, some know not who they serve, most of them, and some of our people know not who they serve either, because the fact is y'all are sacrificing to devils. Y'all sacrifice to demons, and y'all are stuck in this matrix. So in an attempt to help you get out this matrix and out religion and out of all those things that are controlled mechanisms, I'm hoping that this video will break down more of the matrix to you, because the matrix unfortunately cannot be explained just in one video. It takes a series of videos. In the previous video I've showed you three, part 1, part 2, and part 3 parts of the matrix to let you know their end game. Now, let's let you learn more about the matrix, and all I got to say is all praise to the Most High.
Now in complete control!
I'm gonna make him an offer again.
Stop trying to control everything and just let go.
To jeopardize it.
In the previous video, I mentioned that the Matrix tone can be described in a single phrase, the story of humanity. The reason that tone, which is generally speaking the feeling or mood evoked by a film, can be broken down into a series of words is because of a little something that human beings do with considerable ease that I'll call stimuli synthesis. This is when a person collects mounds of information with their senses, the size of the room they're in, the amount of people in the room, how bright the room is, how loud the room is, and so on, and deciphers it into a single, subjective appraisal. When we are receiving all this input from the senses, instead of being overwhelmed, the information washes over us and our brains start automatically registering each bit of stimuli as a series of stratified emotional complexes, a concept I explained in the introductory video. And as these impressions of the room compound and synthesize, something emerges. Some people might call it atmosphere, but we can also use the word tone. So the brain can take a mountain of data and translate it into tone. But what about data that's not coming from your senses, but is, say, read from a history book, a description of the past? Does that have a tone? Well, do you have an emotional reaction to, say, the events of the French Revolution or the Holocaust? But could you take that feeling and describe it as a form of lighting or the composition of a painting? This is Picasso's Guernica, which is a depiction of the bombings of the town of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War by the Nazis. This is clearly not an exact representation of a particular bombing, but rather an abstract representation of the feeling that the bombings gave off. Grotesque, inhuman, and out of some nightmarish fever dream. So history, within the mind, can give rise to various types of shapes, colors, and yes, lighting. This is Caravaggio's The Incredulity of St. Thomas, which is a scene from the Bible that depicts Thomas, who doubted the resurrection of Jesus, being confronted by the very disproof of his doubt, telling him to
And as you know, the whole Mr. J thing is all BS. So let's go a little further until we actually give you some real facts. That whole story's flawed.
So what if you were to lump all the events in history together? What definite tones would emerge? Well, maybe nothing at first, just a mess of different emotional inflections. But as the info were to sink in, perhaps, some patterns would arise, like people's tendency towards evil, wantonness, and desire for power. But maybe the flip side of the coin also, where for some, compassion, empathy, and goodness were on display. Maybe a myth would start to form amongst all the raw data. Good versus evil, truth versus delusion, humanity versus inhumanity, light versus dark, positives versus negatives, a series of ones and zeros. The story of humanity. What tones emerge now? Well, if I had to pick a type of lighting to best describe the dichotomy of good versus evil found throughout history, I would pick noir lighting. Noir lighting first popped up actually in paintings. This is an example of a style called chiaroscuro that was made popular during the Renaissance period in Europe. Painters like Leonardo da Vinci and Caravaggio used this type of lighting for a desired dramatic effect. An effect taken from what naturally occurred when artists started with colored paper for their paintings and would have to work from this base tone towards a brighter tone to create highlights and towards darker tones to create shadows. Then came the Expressionist and German Expressionist period of art in the late 1800s that coincided with the emergence of film. This movement was greatly affected by the events of World War I, inspiring artists to try to change the socio-political landscape through expressing discontent with power structures and addressing the devastation and horror of what those structures had brought. So, in attempting to rectify what was wrong in the present, the Expressionists used the chiaroscuro style to express the darkness found in the realm of politics and power, and the starkly dramatic effects that it had on humanity. This is a German Expressionist film from 1920 called The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, about a man who suspects a mad doctor, Caligari, of utilizing a somnambulist to commit.
Now, if you don't know what this means, a somnambulist is a way to make up a lie about somebody, and actually some of it is stuff that you're doing, but you point the finger at somebody else so that everybody can get mad at that somebody, and it gives you the right, and they'll have your back so that you can start a war with them.
At a series of murders in a small town. But it turns out that the man who suspects the doctor is actually the insane one, and Caligari is the doctor of the asylum where he is kept. This narrative about the impotence of the everyman, who can see the evil and power but is helpless to do anything about it unto the point of being treated as insane, or even incarcerated if they were to speak out, uses the chiaroscuro style to emphasize the darkness that the elite class, represented in Caligari, had brought on the world through their scheming and devious plans, blanketing everything like the fallout from an ash cloud. Then came World War II, which, in affecting the entire world, saw the emergence of film noir from Hollywood. Film noir stands out as the style of filmmaking in the Hollywood.
New World Order, controlling what they want so they can make things happen, such as all the families I mentioned and so forth, put on plenty of videos.
System, in no small part to its lighting. This is an example of traditional Hollywood lighting. Notice the shadows on the face. This would be an example of studio lighting, using usually a 1:2 ratio for the men and a 1:1 ratio for the women. The 1:1 being an even lighting from one side of the face to the other side, and a 1:2 meaning that one side of the face is twice as bright as the other. This was used in part to glamorize actors and sets and make them appear more stereotypically handsome, pretty, and appealing to the audience, which may add a sort of Hollywood gloss for heightened draw and maximum profit, but it also lacks realism. Film noir uses chiaroscuro style lighting, usually to emphasize the grittiness and sleaziness that is or akin to reality of the backwards worlds of the pulp crime and detective novels that were being adapted. Darkness around every corner, shadows covering every surface, a grungy, depressed reality with a cast of unsavory characters. Germany rising in the east, a sort of evil gas cloud spreading, threatening to smother and toxify everything in its path. The darkness spreading, the threat looming. This sprawling darkness is a predominant theme throughout the history of humanity. Groups consumed with domineering and soulless ideology make war and oppress others. Then it is the choice of the oppressed and disparaged groups to fight back and overcome their oppression. In the Matrix, the oppressed group is the humans, and the oppressors are the machines that enslave most of mankind in pods, hardwiring their brains into a simulation of reality.
The machine will represent the beast system.
But 99% of people hardwired in don't understand they are being oppressed, that their life isn't real, that they are being controlled. Nonetheless, the darkness permeates their every waking moment in the form of noir lighting. From the oppressive time of World War I that gave rise to German Expressionism, to the horrors and oppositions of World War II that inspired the tone of film noir, the thread between the two events that informed the artistic movements is the same thread that connects the overall arc and story of humanity, and evil spreads, and in opposition to that evil fights back. On the next episode of The Psychology of Film, we'll be looking at the use of angles in The Matrix and how that works into its overall tone through dissecting shots and seeing how each angle builds compositionally into a dense and effective emotional complex.